Okay, here we go. So we're at chapter 5, the book of Teshuva, which means literally the letter or the treatise on Teshuva from the Alter Rebbe, who wrote it in the early 1800s. It's an incredible teaching of Teshuva, where the first 3 chapters of the book is really describing the mechanics of Teshuva. What is Teshuva? What Teshuva is not? But now we're getting into the Kabbalah of Teshuva, the much deeper um, uh, parts to Teshuva. What we learned in the previous chapter is that there's actually 2 layers to Teshuva. Besides for fragmentation of sin that is caused within you and within a relationship, the sin also has a big stain on the relationship with God. So that we've learned. But now what we're learning is that not only does it have a stain on your relationship within yourself, within a person that you affected, or within God, but it also stains and fragments God's name itself. God's name we know is Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey. And the Hey of God's name, there's 2 Heys. Both of them are stained through your tissue, through your sin. Depending on the sin, it could be on the lower Hey or the higher Hey. And therefore, our teshuva is tashuv Hey, is actually to return the Hey back into the name of God. And depending on the caliber of sin, will depend on the caliber of the teshuva. So today we're learning chapter 5, which is a direct continuation of chapter 4 that introduced this idea. And last chapter we learned more about especially at the end of the chapter, we learned about the details of the letters, how the yud, the hey, the vav, and the hey, how it's referring to another level of the sefirot of God, which is the mode, the method in which God created the world using his 10 sefirot, and also how the letters of God's name exists within our soul. And therefore, when we sin, we make a stain in our soul and a stain in the name of God with which God created the world. So therefore, our sin really has a universal impact and a cosmic impact by affecting the whole world. And therefore, there's an urgency in our teshuva to making sure to repair that fragmentation within the world, within God's name, etc. So I'm not much of a philosopher, but they say, I don't think it's a real story, because how would we know that it happened? But we know that Socrates, the famous philosopher, he died for his teachings. I think he died from hemlock, but I don't know. Someone else would, know more about that. But we know that when he came to heavens, he wanted to go to paradise. And the angel asked him, "Why do you deserve to go to paradise?" And he made a simple calculation. He told the angels that Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his son, didn't have to do it, but was willing to sacrifice his son, he was given the greatest reward. Because he was ready to do it for the sake of God, he was given great reward. I actually sacrificed myself, so for sure I deserve a reward. So the angel answered back, metaphorically, obviously, they told him that all you did was exchange one desire for another desire. What that means is you desire to be alive, but you also desired to practice what you preach. So dying for your teachings was a desire of yours anyway. So it was all from a selfish place. Abraham, there was nothing selfish in what he did. Being separated from God was unfathomable. It wasn't even, there was no chance of that. So for Abraham to be ready to listen to God, there was nothing selfish about it. It just there couldn't be the expression is nicht der kann and nicht der will seinen abgerissen von Göttlichkeit. He can't and he can't and he doesn't want to be separated from God. Another story that I've shared before about the Shlemazel, the guy that can't hold a job, nothing, he has no luck. Like Shlemazel means lo mazal, which means he has no good fortune. And everyone disrespects him. His own wife can't stand him. because he can't hold the job down and he's always doing the wrong thing. So he reads an article about Diamond Island, which is a place that you could go. All you have to do is pay your ticket there, but the whole island is filled with diamonds. Instead of sand, they have diamonds. You could collect as much as you want. And he goes, I'll say the story quickly because you've heard it from me before, and he sees an incredible amount of diamonds, and he goes for dinner, and they tell him diamonds is not how you pay. He wants to pay. And they say over here, you pay with chicken fat, with schmaltz. That's the currency of the island. So he starts working his way to make some schmaltz and more schmaltz. Eventually, he totally forgot about the diamonds because the currency was schmaltz. So finally, he makes his way back home with boats filled of schmaltz. And the family are so excited to see him coming back with diamonds. And really, all he comes back with is schmaltz. Those are the two stories that I want to start today, chapter 5, with. One is about the purity of a soul, like we see by Abraham, that being connected with God was the only thing. There was nothing that could separate him from God, unlike Socrates. And then the story of totally being disconnected, the guy that totally lost track of his diamonds and instead went for the chicken schmaltz. It's how in our world it's so easy to be sidetracked and disillusioned by the currency of the world with what's important, and honor and fame and ego and money, all, and greed and jealousy, all the things that just come with world. It's so easy for your soul to be sidetracked and disillusioned and yeah. So you would think that you could either have one or the other. Either you're in a place of purity or you're a place of disconnection. But the truth is, they're not mutually exclusive, which means that we could have both. Part of us is pure and part of us is disconnected. Part of our soul remains plugged into what's deeper. The part of it is disillusioned by sin and sidetracked by world and could make a fragmentation within God's name. How is that? So we know that there's two verses in chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, which is the parsha of Hazinu. Hazinu is one of the most famous sections of the Torah, where it's Moshe in a song who sings a song. It's called Shirat Moshe. We know that earlier in the book of Exodus, chapter 15, we have the incredible song of the Jews led by Moshe singing at the sea. And then in the book of Numbers, we have a short song of the Jews, Shirat Yisrael, when they were saved in the portion of Chukas, they were saved from the Edomites. But at the end of the Torah, we have a song of Moshe, who most of the song is really a rebuke of the Jewish people, which is Hazinu Hashemayim v'adabeira, listen up heavens and I will speak. And then Tishma haaretz imrei pi, and let the world listen, let the earth listen to the utterances of my mouth. So in there, Moshe actually says two verses. One verse he says, we quoted in the last chapter, which is Chelek Havaya Amo, that his people is a portion of God. Hold on 1 second. One second. Son is just waiting to get into preschool. Sorry, everybody. Okay, sorry about that. So one verse from Parashat Hazinu is Moshe saying, Pelek Havaya Amo, that his nation, talking about the Jewish people, is a portion of Havaya. Havaya is God's tetragrammaton, God's holy name. And Moshe is saying that us, the Jewish people, are our root is from the name of Havaya, the name of the holy name of God. Another verse that Moshe says, um, uh, actually in the same verse, is Yaakov Hevel Nachalato, which means Jacob, the heritage of Jacob, referring to the Jewish people, is is like a rope. Nachalato is a heritage. So his heritage, meaning the heritage of Jacob, is a rope. So a rope is something that goes from high to low, and something that when you pull the bottom, it also pulls the top. It moves the top as well. What we're saying over here is there's a portion, one verse that Moshe talks about is our people, the souls of the Jewish people are from the name Havaya, which is holy and untouchable. And part of it is like a rope that gets affected, or even a rope could be severed, be disconnected from the higher part. The lower part will be cut off. What we see from there is there's a sin that could be affecting the Jewish person to the place where it totally stains their soul and can be affected to the point where it could even be severed. It could be totally disconnected from from the source, like a rope. But then at the same time, there's a part of the soul that isn't affected or it can't be disconnected, no matter the sin. So it's almost like a mixed message that Moshe gives us that on one hand, there's a purity there that keeps the soul untouchable, that keeps the soul deeply rooted within the name of God. Yaakov, that Chelek Havaya Amo. And then there's a part of the soul that could be so deeply affected through sin and touched and stained that it could be severed. So there's a part of the soul that is affected and a part of the soul that remains unaffected. There's a part of sin that could affect the name of God, and there's a sin that remains untouchable and can't affect the name of God. The Hey of God's name, there's Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey. So there's two Heys in God's name. The way we were learning it in chapter 4 is that the Hey of God's name is touchable. That's what is able to be affected through sin. But the higher letters of God's name, which is the Yud, that remains untouchable. That remains unaffected by sin. The point of what we're bringing out over here is that when we do teshuva, it's not only teshuva for our sin, and it's teshuva to realign ourselves with our soul, but teshuva is also to bring back that connection that may have been affected in our relationship with God, and to bring back the fragmentation that we caused within the name of God itself. The Hey, bringing it back to the name, to the Vav, or the Hey and bringing it back to the Yud, which is the higher Hey, the higher level of Teshuva. So, and as we learned last week, we know that the universe was created through God's speech, whereas the soul, humanity, was created uh, through God's breath, through God blowing. Speaking is much more peripheral, whereas blowing is much deeper. So we learned that creation was came to be through an external part of God, through speech, but blowing is from the essence. That's the humanity was created from the essence of God. But over here in chapter 5, we learn another difference. We learn that when you speak, it could speak loud and it could even travel, for example, to another room. Even if I'm in this room, I speak loud enough, people on the other side of a wall or people on the other side of the door are able to hear what I'm speaking. But breath, blowing, you can't feel a blow through a wall. It interrupts the breath, the blowing. So speech could carry its sound through a wall, whereas breathing, a blowing, can't. So when God decided to breathe and create the soul, create humanity, we can choose to put up a wall. And if a wall is put up, then that connection is interrupted. Whereas when God spoke and it created the world, even if the world chooses to put up a wall, which means to disconnect themselves from God, they still are able to hear the voice. They're able to still receive the nourishment needed for their existence, like speech that could carry over even over an interruption. Whereas a soul that puts up a wall, which the way we're describing that is a sin. A sin is an interruption between God and us. So it's like a wall that we put up to separate. If there's a wall put up, the blowing, which is the inner part of God, can't carry through a wall, which means the sin interrupts between the vital between God and his creating us, that gets interrupted. And therefore, in the olden days, when a person would do a sin that carried tremendous weight, it would actually interrupt their connection to the point where they would die. It was called death by the hands of heaven. And in the olden days, in the times of the temple, there were certain sins that if a person committed them, the punishment was karet, which means they would die by the age of 60 years old. And it wasn't really just a punishment, it was that their source of life was disconnected. It wasn't even, it was a ramification more than a punishment. There was a consequence more than a punishment. It was that they severed their source of life through a certain sin that erected a wall, and therefore they weren't able to carry that, receive that nourishment of life anymore. Uh,
Rabbi, that's terrifying.
I know. So,
If we actually understand the ramifications of that, I think we would live a much more circumspect life because each breath is what keeps us alive. And if we just say, oh, we can do it without God, you just say, okay, I'll just cut off the source. Oh
right,
my goodness.
right. Oh my goodness is right. And Tanya, I mean, in chapter 6, which we'll, God willing, get to in a few weeks, it asks a brilliant, it's going to answer a brilliant question. The question we have is, so why doesn't that sin sever the connection anymore? It's the same sin, but back in the day, it would actually sever the connection. Nowadays, it won't. There's people that, do those sins. And we're talking about sins that, um, eating chametz on Pesach, the sin in the olden days, I mean, the sin is karet. Yom Kippur, violating Yom Kippur, the sin is karet. And back in the day, it would carry that punishment of karet, which means a person would die by the age of 60. Nowadays, it doesn't happen. So the Alter Rebbe's question is why? And in chapter 6, we're going to get to the bottom line of the answer, which is pretty fascinating. So we'll wait till we get there. But for over here, quoting the prophet Yeshayahu, quoting the prophet Isaiah, he says, "Avonotechem mavdilim," that our sins is what separates us. So more critical than the consequence, um, more critical than the punishment of our sin is really the consequence that it causes, which is the separation, the wall that is being put up. It's almost like in a relationship, you could have the person, spouses. One of the spouses did something terrible, but more terrible than the actual act is the feeling of betrayal, is the wall that you put up. It's not so much what you did on the other side of the wall, it's more that there was a betrayal. Or in a business deal, if you have partners, um, and one betrayed the other, it's not so much what they did, it's more about the actual betrayal of their partnership. So when we put up a wall, it's not so much, it's about, and there are certain sins that puts up that wall that totally severs the connection. Where God is on this side, breathing, which is what we said, how God created humanity and Adam by the breath. And on the other side of the wall, you can't feel that breath, which means the connection is being interrupted. And we are the ones that are putting up that wall, that interruption. So ultimately, let's just get to the bottom line and then we'll get inside. Teshuva if we put up the example of the wall that sin is putting up, teshuva is to break down the wall. So you could look at sin just as a personal thing that I made a mistake and I have to fix it. You could look at sin, much broader, which is there's a cosmic energy of negativity that I brought to the world that I have to fix. And even more broad or a little deeper, through my sin, I actually made a fragmentation in God's name. I made a universal stain, and even in God's name, I separated the letter hey from the rest of God's name. So therefore, teshuva on a bigger level is to repair God's name. Teshuva is to take down the wall that separates between me and God. And like I said earlier, there's a part of our soul that is beyond fragmentation of God. Like Chela Kavaya Amo, there's a part of our soul that no matter what happens, it can't get sidetracked. It's always essentially connected with God. But then there's a part of our soul that can get fragmented and disillusioned, like the story of the Diamond Island, where he totally lost track of what's important. And then you have to work on that teshuva to repair it. So now, if we're going to get inside now on page 79, if you're looking in the book. If you're looking on the Kindle, I'll pull it up in a moment. But over here we have how sin affects your soul, which is the title of the chapter, where we're going to get more into the details of this idea. Okay. I'm hoping between this week and next week we'll try to finish the chapter because it's a rather short one. And chapter 6, which is the next chapter, will finish the idea of this Kabbalah of Teshuva before we get into the higher level of Teshuva. It'll give us a better picture of the idea that Alter Rebbe is expressing. Okay, how sin affects your soul. Chapter 5, Section 1, the soul's connection in this world. In chapter 4, the Tanya explained how in its heavenly source, your soul is rooted in God's sacred name, which is the Tetragrammaton. Now we will learn how even when your soul descends into this world, it retains that connection, which means even here, we're still connected, our soul is still connected with God's holy name. Now, as for the process of bringing down the divine soul from its heavenly source into this world and placing it in a person's body, this process is powered by divine speech, or to be precise, the deep source of divine speech, which is the divine breath. So we have the divine speech. In chapter 4, we learned that speech contains two components. Letters are the superficial expression of speech, formed when breath hits one of the five organs of speech. And then you also have breath, which is the inner aspect of speech, which rises from deep inside the thoracic cavity. This is also true of divine speech, a metaphor for God's power of manifestation, which is Malchus. The superficial expression of divine speech is its constituent letters, which are packets of creative energy. Within those letters is the deep source of divine speech, namely the divine breath. So we have the speech, which is in ourselves, it's how the speech is articulated through the breath hitting the five organs, which we explained to be the throat, the teeth, the lips, the tongue, and the palate. And so divine speech, which is God's malchus, God's power of manifestation to reveal and communicate into the world, God's speech comes about through a deep source, which is God's breath, and then it comes out through packets of energy, which is God's speech. The Tanya teaches us here that the soul, even as it is founded below in this world, retains a connection with a deep source of divine speech, the divine breath. So even after we are created, because ultimately we were breathed and we were brought into being, but then we also had to be created with a body. So we are also created by speech. But even after we have speech, we retain a connection with a deeper source, which is the breath. This is hinted to by the second letter Hey of the Tetragrammaton mentioned above. The second letter Hey of the Tetragrammaton mentioned above. So we have two hays, and this is the second hay. I don't know how exactly. Let's see the next paragraph. As we learned in chapter 4, the letter hay, comparable to hay or to H in English, is produced from breath alone. It therefore is a direct expression of the source of speech inside the body, the breath that rises from the thoracic cavity around the heart. The divine breath with which the soul retains a connection in this world is represented by the last hay of the tetragrammaton. Okay, there's a lot that we're saying here, but the point is that we have God's breath that he breathed and we came to be. And then after the breath, we have the speech. Even after we were created through speech, we retain our connection with the breath of God. What is symbolizing the breath of God? It's the letter Hey, the lower Hey of God's name is that breath of God. Why is it the Hey? Because just like in English, the H sound is just the sound of a breath. So the Hey is the breath of God, how even after we were created by speech, we retain that connection with the breath. He's going to bring sources. I guess let's read the sources and then we'll get to the practical lesson. The Tanya cites proof. I think we're going to have two proofs from scripture. Number one is as follows. As the verse states, and God blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man had a living soul. And one who blows from his innards, which means from his insides, in the name of the Zohar. This verse describes the soul's shifting identity as it passes from its heavenly source into a body. In heaven, God blew the soul from his innards. However, the fact that the soul's passage down to earth and the man had a living soul, which is the next verse, is mentioned in the same verse as God's initial blowing, suggests that even on earth, the soul doesn't totally forget its connection with the innermost depths of God. The Tanya offers us another proof for this idea. And this is the meaning of the verse, for God's portion is his people, Yaakov, Jacob, his allotted inheritance, Hevel. The unusual use of the term Hevel here, which usually refers to a rope, invites interpretation. This means that the soul below remains connected above, like a rope, for example, that is tied on one end above and the other end below. The rope analogy hints to the soul's ongoing connection with its source, despite its formidable journey into this world. So even after being in this world, which is the way we were brought into being from breath of God and then speech of God, which is Malchus, how God expresses himself. Even after that happens, we retain our connection with a deeper source, which is hinted to in the Hey of God's name, which is the breath of God, and also, which is like the H sound. And like we see in the verses, that like a rope, that even after it comes below, it retains its connection to what's above. And also, like we see in the verses, that God breathed, blew into his nostrils, from his nostrils, into his nostrils, the breath of life. And that's from the inner heart. You breathe from the inside. So let's just read the practical lesson and summarize this section. On page 80 in the book. Even after descending into this world, the soul retains a connection with the tetragrammaton, specifically its last letter, Hey. The soul remains connected to the deeper level of divine breath, in contrast to the rest of the universe, which only has a connection to the more superficial divine speech. So the rest of the world has a more superficial connection. But the soul of man, humanity, has a deeper connection, which means even after we are expressed through speech and have a body and our form, we retain a connection with the breath of God, which is God's inside, the inner part of God. And that's hinted to in the letter Hey. And therefore we, as souls, retain a connection with God's holy name, like a rope that retains a connection with the higher part of the rope, with the upper edge of the rope. Any questions? Okay.
Naomi has Naomi was
Thank
trying.
you. I do have a question. You mentioned that the soul of humanity remains connected to the deeper level of divine breath. When you said humanity, I wondered if that meant everybody or only Jewish people.
A good question, and I'm not even looking at, I myself, I was, reading the text, I prepared a little bit in advance. Um, if you look, Adam wasn't a Jew, right? Adam was a human. It blew into his nostrils, and the man had a living soul. Um, so I'm not sure. It's still to be seen. Going through the first line of this chapter, it says "begufa Adam" in a person's body. It doesn't say in a Jew's body. So I'm not sure. We'll have
Yeah,
to.
sometimes I think because they're whoever is writing this is speaking it's like speaking to Jewish people, but because he's so used to only speaking to Jewish people, he makes it sound like it's for everybody, but it's only for Jewish people, but maybe it is for everybody. It's not clear.
I mean, that's why I was looking at the Hebrew also. The Hebrew is going to be the Alter Rebbe's text. And, it doesn't say beguf Yisrael. It says guf Adam. Adam is a person. So, still to be seen. It's a good
I've got
question. I don't have the full answer. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you.
the way I think I learned is that before there was a Jewish people, before there was a Sinai, particularly in the time of Abraham, maybe in the time of Adam, a Jew was defined as a human who sought a connection with the source. And so the people who didn't really care about where they came from were men of the earth. And they were that was the normal person. But the people who strive to understand what we would call God, it wasn't a religious thing because there was no Jew at that point. That person was considered a Yehudi. And so it applied to everybody who came to Abraham and was inspired by him. They were considered Jews in the sense that they were seeking a relationship with the divine.
It's beautiful.
So that was it applies to everybody who wants it. And if you don't want it, you're considered an ignoramus, just a person of the earth. And
you're saying that's now, like nowadays, anyone who's seeking what's beyond, what's more, that would be a person with a godly soul. I love that.
This would apply to them.
I love it.
Wait, but that can't be true because people need to have a halakha conversion in order to be Jewish. So how can we say anybody? It's like saying anybody who wants to be Jewish can.
No, we're not saying to be Jewish. We're saying to have a relationship with God. Anyone who's seeking a relationship with God has a deep divine soul, not necessarily a Jewish soul.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It might be considered Israelites, children of Israel, not Jews, but like how the Igbos or the Pajwan, other lost tribes are not considered Jews, but they're considered Israelites.
Love it.
There's a big distinction.
I love it. Yes, Lynn.
That's interesting.
Couple things. There's just amazed at our tenuous connection with the divine and how it can be shut off very quickly. And we can't really understand why. And I was trying to see a connection, and I don't think it's there, between Hevel and rope, and Hevel, which is vanity, which is in Kohelet. So it's a chet versus a hay. Okay, right. But I just taught the wisdom book. So I'm thinking about Kohelet. And in chapter 12, he talks about how the doors of the streets are shut, so your ears don't hear very well. The sound of the grinding is low. You don't hear. The one rises at the sound of the bird. We get up early. The daughters of the music are brought low. We're afraid of height, terrors. And it's talking about how this, I'm not finding, the golden bowl is broken and the pitcher is shattered of fat fountain, or the wheel is broken and the dust will return to the dust as it was, and the spirit will return to Hashem who gave it. Hevel, Hevel, says Kohelet, Kol HaHevel. So that everything is very tenuous in this life. We see it as solid, but the teacher tells us, you better hold on to it lightly.
Interesting. So I love it. And actually, so I don't think there's a relationship between the Hevel and the Hevel, although the Hevel I think it's mentioned a total of, there's 2 verses there somewhere that Shlomo says Hakol Hevel, Hevel Havelim. Everything is Hevel, vanity of vanity. It's like
Right.
and there's actually 7 stops we do at a funeral
Mhm.
to correspond to the 7 Hevels that Solomon mentions there,
Mhm.
to bring us out from the depths of impurity of Hevel and to bring us to a state of purity to Gan Eden, which is amazing. Um, okay, but now section 2, it's a pretty heavy duty section where we have the spiritual meaning of um, of Charis, which is a big one. So let's try to see if we could finish this text. Um, section 2, the spiritual meaning of Charis. Here we go. Should be able to see it on the screen. The remainder of chapter 5 is aimed at clarifying a question posed in chapter 4. What is the spiritual mechanism of Charis and death through the agency of heaven? And to answer this question, we need to examine what happens when what happens to the soul when a person sins. So now the simple meaning of the verse, what is written in God blew, is to teach us that, for example, when a person blows toward a certain destination and there is some sort of blockage, like a wall or obstruction between the person and that destination, the air which has been blown will not travel through or reach its destination at all. Above, we explain God's blowing of the soul as a hint to the soul's deep root in divine energy. Here, the Tanya offers us a different interpretation of the metaphor. The success of blowing air depends on the absence of any blockage between the blower and the chosen destination. Right? If there is a blockage, the blow of the blower doesn't get to the destination. In the exact same way, if there is something blocking or obstructing a person's body from divine breath, that breath will not reach the body. Speech, on the other hand, can pass through a physical obstruction and be heard. The obstruction here refers to a sin, which carries the penalty of charis, or death through the agency of heaven. Such an obstruction blocks the person's connection to deep divine energy compared to breath, but it will not block the connection of divine speech, the general energy which powers the universe. So even after a sin that doesn't have charis, it's like speech, which means it doesn't cause the blocking of to go through. Like speech is able to carry over a wall and then an obstruction. So therefore, there still is able to be energy carrying through to give life. But if there's an obstruction through a sin, to the degree of charis, then the deeper level, which is breath, can carry through. This explains why in earlier times the transgressor would actually die physically, which is what we said it above in chapter 4. Premature death was an inevitable natural consequence of the sin. Once a divine soul from divine breath becomes disconnected from its source, a person's core energy has been lost and he will die prematurely. But that is only the case for one who possesses a divine soul. That is why other creations who do not have this soul do not experience charis. Because in order to experience charis, there has to be an obstruction from the deeper breath that is not able to carry through. If a person doesn't have that deeper breath carrying through, then no obstruction will stop the energy because it's only coming from the more superficial place, which is of speech. The Tanya presents a problem with the above analysis. However, in reality, there is no physical or spiritual thing that can obstruct God's presence. For do I not fill the heaven and earth, says God, and all the earth is filled with his glory, and there is no place empty of him. God is God in the heavens above, and on the earth below, there is none other. God fills all the worlds. We just brought like 5 or 6 sources to say that God is everywhere. So what are you talking about? That an obstruction, a wall separates and doesn't allow God through. God is filling every space. What does it mean then for the soul to be disconnected from God? Isn't God found everywhere? The great question. The Tanya answers, rather, the meaning of this disconnection is, as written in Isaiah, but your sins have separated between you and your God. God is indeed found everywhere. The disconnection which occurs through sin does not mean God's presence has departed. Rather, it means that the person is unable to receive it. The energy is still there. You just don't, you're no longer a vessel to receive that energy because of the sin. This is the meaning of the verse. Your sins have separated between you and your God. The separation is from your perspective, not from God's. And the reason for this is because sins are a violation of the divine will, which is the energetic source of everything. As the verse states, whatever God desired, he did in the heavens and in the earth. Nothing in the universe can, of its own accord, disconnect from its maker. But if God wills, there can be a disconnection. God's will is the energetic source of everything. And a sin represents a violation of that will or desire. Once God's will is no longer present, the energetic source of everything is lacking and we have a disconnect. So we can't disconnect from God. But if God wills, then there can be a disconnection. So our sin, I don't know if and a sin represents a violation. So our sin is a violation of the will of God. So it's almost like we're removing the will from this place. So therefore, there still is godliness is still everywhere, but we're removing our mode of receiving that will of God in this area, and that causes the disconnection.
Is it fair to say that the will of God, as it's described in Tanya, is like an antenna? And the notion is the sound waves never go away, but sometimes our antenna doesn't pick it up. And so God's will, in a sense, is the antenna within us to allow us to connect to the sound waves like we do with a radio.
So you're saying God's will is the antenna, or
Well, I can't say it is the antenna, but it's akin to the sound waves are always there. We don't always perceive them because of our connection is not sufficient. We don't have the right antenna to connect. And that notion that we call an antenna to connect the sound wave, a radio wave, is kind of like what the Baal Tanya is describing as the will of God, in that our alignment is aligned with God's will, and that therefore there's a connection, there's an antenna, and we pick up the frequencies, the wave.
I love it. Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying here, right? It means that the person is unable to receive it, meaning our antennas are down, and therefore we can receive that wave that is right over our head. But through our sin, our antennas are down. Yeah, I think that's perfect.
And he did it before radio, I believe, right around the same time. I think before radio waves, before Marconi discovered radios, so he couldn't use that description, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's perfect. I just want to read this paragraph again and make sure I understand it. Nothing in the universe can, of its own accord, disconnect from its maker. But if God wills so, there can be a disconnection. God's will is the energetic source of everything, and a sin represents a violation of that will or desire. Once God's will is no longer present, the energetic source of everything is lacking, and we have a disconnect. Okay? As explained above in chapter 4, that the divine will is the source of energetic flow to the universe through the tetragrammaton, hinted to by the thorn of the yud. So if you remember, we had the yud, and there's a little point at the top of the yud that the Alter Rebbe referred to as a thorn, and that's a hint to God's will. As we learned in chapter 4, the most elevated portion of the tetragrammaton is the thorn of the yud, which represents the divine will. The thorn is the source of the energy of the tetragrammaton's 4 letters. If the thorn is damaged through violating the divine will, the flow of energy to the remaining 4 letters will be compromised. And this explains the spiritual dynamic of Charis and death through agency of heaven. That the rope channeling energy from the tetragrammaton to the person is cut and interrupted. Charis is therefore not an imposed punishment that follows after a sin. Rather, it is an inevitable natural consequence of the sin. The apparatus carrying the flow is damaged, so the flow stops because there's a damage over here in the will of God, which is caused through our sin, and therefore the rest of the letters of God's name, which is after the will, after the thorn of the yud, is damaged, and therefore the flow stops, and that's what charis is. The Tanya reminds us of the location in the Tetragrammaton where the soul is connected. As stated above at the beginning of this chapter, that the divine soul is connected to God's deep flow of energy through the second hay of the Tetragrammaton. The Tanya cites a verse that illustrates this point, as stated in the Torah portion of Emor, which we had a week ago, and that soul will be cut off from me, from before me. I am God. The verse stresses from before me, being cut off from before me, implies that the soul is disconnected from the Tetragrammaton, which is me. So you have God's essence, which is hinted to in the Tetragrammaton. So before me means that there's a disconnection of the soul caused by the sin, which is cut off. So there's a disconnection before me, which means in front of the name of Havaya, in front of the Tetragrammaton. Let's just see, there's a Hasidic thought over here from the Zohar, which is on page 82. When a person follows the path of Torah, he draws upon himself a holy, supernal spirit, as the verse states, until a spirit from on high is poured upon us, which is from Isaiah. But when a person perverts his ways, he draws upon himself another spirit from the Sidra Achra, which is the other side, the Klipa, which is the side of impurity. So that's where you cause a severance of that relationship. If you're okay, we're just going to read section 3 on page 84, or this, on the Kindle is just this page, the spiritual meaning of other sins. In section 2, we learned that through a sin which carries the penalty of charis, or death through the agency of heaven, the divine soul becomes completely cut off from its source in the Tetragrammaton. Now we turn to the issue of lesser sins that do not have this severe penalty. What happens to the soul when they are violated? And in the case of other sins that are not punishable by charis or death through the agency of heaven, they do at least inflict some damage, or in Hebrew, pigam, a blemish to the soul, even though they do not cut it off completely, as is known. What exactly is this damage? Is it something undesirable that is added to the soul, or something that is taken away? The term pigam here has the connotation of the defect in a knife. The knife used for ritual slaughter becomes defective when part of the blade is lacking. The Tanya therefore informs us the pagam of the soul means part of its connection is taken away. So when we sin, not to the degree of charis, which is a death through the agency of heaven, but a lower level of sin, it's called a pagam. And a pagam means a defect or a blemish. And just like on a knife used for ritual slaughter, the shochet has to verify very carefully to make sure there's no pagam or defect in the knife. So a defect means that there's a piece of the metal of the blade that's missing. If a piece of the metal blade is missing, it's called a pagam, and it makes a knife unusable or forbidden to use. So in a similar way over here, a sin that is not on the level of charis is a defect, which means there's something that is taken away. Something of the connection that is taken away. A good illustration of this is a thick rope woven of 613 fine strands. Since the above mentioned energetic flow from the Tetragrammaton to the soul is through the 613 mitzvahs, when a person, God forbid, transgresses one of them, a fine strand of the rope is cut. The violation of any of the 613 mitzvahs comprises, to some extent, the connection between the soul and its root in the Tetragrammaton. Multiple transgressions of different sins are also cumulative. They each sever one strand of the rope, we will discuss below in chapter 7, but this does not compare to charis, which causes a disconnect of the entire soul from its root in the Tetragrammaton. So just to summarize this section, and we'll probably finish the chapter next week and go into chapter 6. Just to summarize this pretty heavy duty section, but really important, it seems like we have two types of sins. We have a sin that is of a lesser degree, and then we have a sin that's on the level of charis. Charis means severance or separation. It's totally cutting off the source of our energy flow. And then you have other sins. So if you take the analogy of the rope that the Alter Rebbe just gave us, a rope is comprised, let's say, of 613 strands. When you do a sin, you're severing one fine strand of those 613. So it's weakening the connection. It's making a pagam, which means it's loosening the relationship, the rope, but it's still there. The connection is still there. It's just a weaker connection. But then there's certain averot, certain sins that carry the kares, which means it's a total separation, a total severance of that connection, and that's a much stronger violation, and therefore the source of our flow of energy is cut off, and therefore it's not even a punishment to die. At that point, it's a consequence. It's a natural consequence that when there's no flow of energy anymore because of the sin that was violated that caused kares, the rope is totally severed. So there's two types of sins, one to a lesser degree, which is other sins, and one is the sin that has the consequence of kares. Yes, let's take questions. Go ahead, Naomi.
Okay, so what's an example of a lesser sin or of a greater sin that, the sins that cause kares and the sins that don't cause kares?
So the Torah, it goes through sins that cause kares. One what we just had a couple of weeks ago in the Torah portion of Achrei was the sins of immorality. If a person lies with his father's wife, with his mother, God forbid, that is so immoral that God says that soul is cut off. Another one, like I said, is eating chametz on Passover. Another one would be violating Yom Kippur. Those are sins that have the degree of kares. My daughter Adasa would be, she could probably list you all the sins of kares because she just got tested on all the 613 mitzvahs. There's actually, if I'm not mistaken, only 2 positive mitzvahs that usually they're negative mitzvahs, right? If you violate the commandment of eating chametz on Passover, which is the negative mitzvah, do not eat chametz, it would bring to kares. Or violating Yom Kippur, right? Do not eat on Yom Kippur, it would bring to kares. There's 2 positive ones. One is, if I'm not mistaken, to have a bris on a male, even if they didn't have it as a baby, it's their mitzvah to do later in life, and if they don't, it carries the punishment of kares. And then, let's say, lying doesn't carry the punishment of kares; it's a lesser sin. So it's a sin that severs a strand of the rope, but not all the strands. It severs one of the 613. And anyway, next week, God willing, that we'll end the chapter by explaining if there's a severance through kares, why would the person be able to live to the age of 60? If the flow of their energy is cut off through the sin, they should die immediately. As soon as they commit that sin, they lost their flow of energy. So next week we'll end the chapter of how they could still live to the age of 50 or 60. And also, God willing, we'll get into the chapter 6, which is a really important chapter that will, bring home the whole idea. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great day, Lynn. Bye,
Yeah.
Chava. Bye, Vivian. Bye, Shira. Bye, Naomi. Bye, Steve. And we'll see you
So
next week.
daraba.
And Lag Bomer is on Sunday. We hope you can make it to our barbecue. All right. We'll see you, everybody.
Oh, good. Okay, more questions there.